today we are talking about big long word. Biogeochemical cycles, or just nutrient cycles. Y'all started this adventure with your nitrogen cycle assignment on, I believe it was Thursday for y'all. And today we are talking about the carbon cycle and the phosphorus cycle. All right, so there's something I want to talk about before we jump right into the carbon cycle, and that is the law of conservation of matter. Essentially, matter cannot be created or destroyed. Which means the amount of nitrogen that is on the earth now is the amount of nitrogen that was on the earth years and years ago, unless of course it entered in like a asteroid or something, but we're not going to get into that kind of stuff. Essentially, the amount of oxygen that is in our atmosphere is the amount of oxygen we've had since the beginning, and we can't destroy two oxygen atoms and make a bunch of hydrogen atoms out of the protons left over. It just doesn't work like that. Atoms cannot be created or destroyed. So, bless you. The word nutrient is matter that organisms require for life. So we need oxygen to help carry out cell respiration. So oxygen is a nutrient for us. Same with nitrogen, same with phosphorus. Any any atom, matter that an organism requires for life, and they cycle through the environment. I'm going to use the word circulate, if I could spell. Circulate through the environment. So, you guys talked about the nitrogen cycle on your hybrid day assignment, and now we are going to talk about two more, the carbon cycle and the phosphorus cycle. So, carbon, like we mentioned, is really, really important for our understanding of biology. All life is based in carbon, and that carbon circles through our atmosphere, biosphere, geosphere, all that fun stuff. So, all the rock, all the air, all the living things. So, I'm going to extend this page a little bit. Bring it back. Any questions about this before we get started? I'm going to get a little bit doodly. So, let's start with, where's that? The atmosphere. So, There's a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. Usually that is CO2 or carbon dioxide. Carbon di 2 oxide. Oxygen, 1 carbon, 2 oxygens, carbon dioxide. And there are a bunch of different ways that carbon can get released into the atmosphere as CO2. So I'm going to start down here with sedimentary rock. We got oh, I don't know what that was. And this right here is going to be our ocean. I'm going to fix that because that looks obnoxious. Oh my goodness. All right. So the one specific process is when CO2 goes from the atmosphere to the ocean and vice versa. It is called the ocean atmosphere exchange. We're not going to get into the chemical details of that, but essentially carbon dioxide can be released directly from the ocean into the atmosphere and settle from the atmosphere into the ocean. Can I get a mask check, please? All right, there's another set of processes. And that is, oh my goodness, why does that keep happening? My amazing art skills coming in handy. Carbon dioxide can also get released in the atmosphere through volcanoes and other geological processes. So we're just going to write volcanoes. Can release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Rivers can release carbon dioxide into the ocean through runoff and something called weathering. So as weather, air, wind, rain kind of slowly breaks down rock on the surface of the earth, that rain washes all the carbon that was in those rock-like substances into the ocean. So rivers can release carbon dioxide into the ocean through runoff and weathering, and that all of the carbon in the ocean can be deposited into sedimentary rock. So as that carbon gets too heavy, it will all clump up and sink down to the bottom and eventually form rock at the bottom of the ocean. I'm going to create a different little pathway, and that is through fossil fuels. So fossil fuels down at the bottom, they are brought up through mining. And then humans kind of have it for a minute. Human sources. So we keep it stored up in oil and all that stuff. And eventually, as that is burned, that CO2 is released into the ocean or into the atmosphere. One more kind of dirt level thing, and that is soil and soil organisms. So dirt, soil, and all of the little bacteria that live in the dirt and soil can store carbon, and they get that carbon through decomposition. We're just gonna we talked about decomposers. They are the ones doing this decomposition. So this is where our decomposers come into our nutrient cycling as opposed to our energy flow. So our decomposers take live organisms and they break them down, and then soil and soil organisms kind of suck up that carbon. Land plants have a lot of carbon stored in them. If you think about all of the carbon that makes up all of those carbohydrates that kind of keep our structures going for all our trees and plants and stuff, that's a lot of the Earth's carbon. And they can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the act of taking that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and fixing it into sugars that we can use. Those plants then get eaten by consumers. So the carbon in those plants gets transferred to the consumer. And then our land plants, our consumers, and our soil organisms all carry out cell respiration. Cell respiration is what we do when we burn our sugars. So we take, it's essentially the opposite of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is taking carbon dioxide and water and making sugar. Cell respiration is taking that sugar and breaking it down into carbon dioxide and water. So, I know it got a little messy, and that's how carbon dioxide gets released into the atmosphere. Is there any questions about this? There's a couple little key points I want to hit, and then I will move into the phosphorus cycle, which I think is far more interesting. That's just me. Okay. We talked about primary producers in our producer to consumer lesson, but I do want to talk briefly about photosynthesis and cell respiration. So, photosynthesis. Like we said, they are opposite chemical processes. So photosynthesis is taking carbon dioxide, so 6 of them. And we're going to take 6 waters. And we're going to use the sun. And that's going to give us sugar and oxygen. Cell respiration is taking that sugar and oxygen, breaking it down, and giving us carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Ooh, that's not a lie. One really cool aspect about the carbon cycle is that there is a missing sink. I'm not talking like a kitchen sink. Missing. Whoops. So, when we talk about biogeochemical cycle, there are things called sources and there are things called sinks. So a source is anything that puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and a sink is anything that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We can do a lot of fancy calculations with the amount of carbon that we are putting into the atmosphere, calculating how much fossil fuels we burn using the amount of people and organisms to like calculate the rate of cell respiration and photosynthesis. But 1 to 2 billion tons, that's billion with a B, of carbon dioxide are unaccounted for. Meaning we know we put this much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but it's not all in the atmosphere. But we don't know what sucked it up. We think it's in the northern forests. It's like Canada, Russia. There's a lot of trees up there. We think that's where some of it went. But we don't know for sure. Because we don't know for sure, it means our carbon cycle idea is incomplete. Even though it's been something that we've been studying for hundreds and hundreds of years, we still don't have the full picture, which is a pretty common concept in biology. There's always more to learn. We don't always know everything. Anybody have any questions about that? All right. Now, for some fun stuff, we are going to talk about the phosphorus cycle. It's an E and R. Phosphorus cycle. That's a C. All right. The phosphorus cycle mainly occurs in the oceans and lithosphere, which is like the top layer of rock. So it's not really in the atmosphere as much as we would like to think. Mainly in oceans and lithosphere. So we're just going to put rock. So, mainly in oceans and lithosphere. So even though we said it wasn't in the atmosphere, I'm still going to draw it out. So atmosphere. Not a heck of a lot of interaction, but we're still going to put it on there. So, like we said, there's a lot of phosphorus stored in the lithosphere, which is that rock. So we're going to start with mineable rock. So rock that we can access. A lot of rock is not mineable. It is way too deep. We can't get to it. So that mineable rock is mined. And we use it to create fertilizer. Fertilizers and agriculture account for a lot of the human-influenced phosphorus cycle. So that mineable, that goes this way. That mineable rock and the fertilizers can all run off into rivers. So fertilizers can run off into the rivers, and the mineable rock can erode or weather, and that will all bring phosphorus into rivers. We're going to talk about the ocean wider. Like we said, it mostly takes place in the ocean. We're also going to bring in sedimentary rock. So, phosphorus can get into the ocean and into sedimentary rock from rivers. So, there's also a lot of sedimentary rock on and around riverbeds, and those rivers can give phosphorus to the ocean and rivers, rock through runoff. Then there is a process called uplift. That process of uplift brings that sedimentary rock up to where we can reach it. So the rock that's underneath the crust of the earth is constantly moving. It's still solid. It's not liquid, it's still solid, but it's kind of like moon sand. Have you ever played with moon sand? That is essentially how all of the rock underneath the earth's crust exists. So how we have tectonic plates that kind of float along the Earth's crust or along the Earth's surface, and they came together and formed Pangea, and they broke apart and they came back together. That's because that second layer of rock is that semi-solid kind of idea. So because that moves, that can push rock up and become mineable again. Now, in oceans, we're gonna bring a whole new color into this. In oceans, we have producers, consumers, and decomposers. Producers, consumers, and decomposers. Just like we do on land, but like we said, phosphorus likes to stick to the oceans and rock. So producers, consumers, and decomposers. Now, decomposers can get phosphorus by, guess what, decomposing both producers and consumers. If producers die, if consumers die, decomposers will get them in the end. Producers will also give phosphorus to consumers because the consumers will eat the producers. And the decomposers will break that phosphorus down to where it floats around in the ocean, and the producers will suck that up. A very, 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 very similar process happens on land, where we have like land consumer or land producers. So we'll just do land plants. We have our consumers. Our decomposers. And our soil. Our plants and our consumers will both be decomposed. That decomposition puts phosphorus into the soil. The land plants, through a process called uptake, get that phosphorus, and then the consumers eat the land plants. Does that make sense? I know it's not necessarily the most invigorating thing for 9 a.m. on a metaphorical Monday, but it's really important for us to understand, and I'm going to give you an example of why it's important for us to understand. So give me 1 second. I'll let you get that down. Does anybody have any questions? All right. There is a process that is really, really important to farmers, to fishermen, to us because we do benefit from the jobs of farmers and fishermen. There's a process directly related to phosphorus called eutrophication. E-U-T-R-O-P-H. Eutrophication. Keyword, buzzword. A little star by it. Eutrophication. Eutrophication is the overgrowth of producers usually algae, due to increased phosphorus levels. So have you ever been driving down the road, or you know somebody who has a lake or a pond, and there's just that layer of like green scum across the top of it, where it just looks like floating grass? The entire top of the pond is green. You ever seen that? Yes, no, maybe so. Yes. Okay, that is eutrophication. So we got all these little algae dudes that are flourishing because of all that phosphorus in the water. In extreme cases, this can lead to something called hypoxia. Hypoxia is essentially decreased oxygen in the water. And this can lead to dead zones. So, this is why it's really, really important to farmers. Because if a farmer or a big farm is using fertilizers that have a lot of phosphorus in it, and that phosphorus runs off into the nearest aquatic ecosystem, then we put a lot of phosphorus into that ecosystem. And when that phosphorus gets taken up by those algae, the algae will flourish. Now, normally we're fine with like a lot of primary producers. They help us. They're a lot of the baseline of a lot of food chains. But if we have so many primary producers at the top of that lake, it'll suck up all the oxygen in the water. And when it releases it, it doesn't release it back into the water, it releases it into the air. So all of that oxygen that was in that water already is being used up because we've got so many more living organisms. And that will kill all of the fish in the lake and all of the things that live around the lake and feed off of the fish. This happened on a major scale. I think it was late 2000s, early 2010s. There's Yes. Gulf of Mexico, oil spill. All of that oil had all that phosphorus in it, because remember, we get it from fossil fuels. So much phosphorus dumped into the Gulf of Mexico. So much algae growth. Killed everything. Destroyed a lot of fishermen's lives because all of what they made their livelihood on died because all the algae overgrew and killed all of the fish. Disrupted not only the ecosystem, but the economy. Does that make sense? That's why this is really, really important. That's why fertilizers are regulated by the government, because we don't want things like what happened in the Gulf of Mexico to happen again on major scales on a lot of like land-based ecosystems. All right, so let's see. There's one more concept I want to talk about. But does anybody have any questions about eutrophication of the phosphorus cycle? Yeah. All right. One last thing I want to talk about, and that is nutrient limitation. So, nutrient limitation. Essentially, if sun and water are available, and by available I mean like abundant, so we've got all the sun and all the water an ecosystem could need. The primary productivity of an ecosystem is limited by the availability of nutrients. So, if we've got all of the water and all of the sunshine we need, our primary producers, our plants, can only produce so much of our sugars. They can only live and produce and thrive so much if there isn't if they don't get the nutrients they need. So let's say that they've got all, like, we are in an ideal environment, right? All the sunshine, all the water these trees could need. But something happened and all the phosphorus is gone. Those trees can only work at a certain level when we've got that limit on phosphorus. So, the nutrient whose supply limits productivity is called the limiting nutrient. I would underline this, highlight it if you can. The concept of a limiting nutrient is really, really important. So if we've got all the water, all the sunshine we need, but they can't get the carbon to build those carbohydrates, if they can't get the carbon dioxide to start photosynthesis, they can't make the energy they need. They can't be productive. Does that make sense? Okay. The concept of a limiting nutrient is really important, especially when we get to the idea of carrying capacity, which we will talk about. So that is what I have for notes for you today. There is an exit ticket on Canvas. So if you get your Chromebooks out and answer that exit ticket for me, please. You will be tomorrow for your hybrid assignment discussing climate and how these biogeochemical cycles and energy flow affect the climate and how the climate affects populations. So open up your Chromebooks, make sure I published that exit ticket for today. Knock that out for me, please.